Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I am your host. Today in the studio, we have Meredith Chacon. Now, Meredith has been practicing as an attorney for 21 years. She's a former prosecutor, was a prosecutor for 15 years, and I am lucky to say that she was one of our first chair family violence prosecutors, did an excellent job in the court. Currently, Meredith is working as a partner for Chacon, Campbell, and Alexander. Now, Meredith has a wide range of experiences, very large resume. Rather than have me read them, I'm going to ask Meredith to talk to us a little bit about herself. Hello, Meredith.
Hi, Judge. It's so good to see you.
It's great to see you. Thank you for coming in today. I know you've had a busy day.
It's been crazy at the courthouse, yes.
Is that an understatement? Especially with the new computer system going up?
Oh, that's a whole nother podcast, Judge.
We should have a podcast devoted to the new computer system. I agree. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that you ran for office at one point, and I was at a location. You were giving a stump speech. I heard it. I was impressed by it. You're involved in a lot of community type of activities. You want to tell us some of the things that you do?
Well, so when I started at the DA's office 25 years ago, I was actually a victim advocate. And so my first entrance into the legal system was really at a different, not a non-lawyer position. And so I hold victims kind of close to my heart and have had a heart for that work. So when I left the DA's office in 2018, after being a family violence prosecutor for a very long time, I went to work at Child Safe, and I was there as the director of, we called it special projects, but that allowed me to work on the child sex trafficking care coordination team, as well as working on the multidisciplinary team investigating child abuse. And I was able to sit on the first statewide multidisciplinary team that we've had in Texas. And it was so that we could have better resources for child abuse investigations, especially in like smaller counties, modeled after things we were doing in the larger counties. So I did a lot of work in Austin with CAC Texas with that. And then because of my experience in the child protection courts and the child abuse courts, I also do ad litem work. And so I'm very involved in the CPS system, and I sit on the board of the Methodist Children's Home in Waco, which is where my grandfather grew up. So that's another reason that issues of abuse and neglect and foster care are very close to my heart and my family's.
So when you talk about ad litem work, that's work that deals with folks that need an attorney appointed to them when they're involved with the Child Protective Services caseload.
Sure. We represent, when you're on the list, you don't get to pick and choose. You represent families. Like, so you might represent a mother, you might be appointed to represent a father, or you might be appointed to represent the children that are removed from their families, because then you can be the voice of what's in their best interest.
It's got to be challenging work, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That part of my practice, while it is probably the least number of cases that I have, is probably the most time-consuming part of the practice.
Not bad. A little bit different. You know, when I was a prosecutor and it was time for me to leave the DA's office, I remember going to my boss, telling him, it's time. You know, I had a lot of student loans, so I needed to think about having to pay those off. And I told him back then, I was so invested in my job as a prosecutor, I told him, it's going to be difficult for me to think about representing folks on the other side. He laughed, put his arm around me, told me, Ron, you're going to do the exact same thing, right? And so you're one of those individuals. You were at the DA's office a long time. I remember when you had those different types of jobs within the office that you just mentioned. And when you left the DA's office, I thought, well, here's one that I thought would be a career prosecutor, which is a beautiful thing, you know, a career defense attorney.
I was worried about that too, that you say that about being a defense attorney and how I would accept it when I first went back into private practice in 2020. And I have loved every minute of it.
We were just talking before we turned the mics on. When you were working with me in the 379th, you just threw out your experience on defending an individual and getting a murder case dismissed or an acquittal, whatever the case was. I think you were involved in the fastest verdict that we had in the 379th.
Yeah, that was a crazy case. do you remember, Judge, that man would not speak. So he was malingering. He'd been determined to be competent. I think they'd had more than one evaluation at the point that I was moved into the court. And so he had shot, I believe it was his ex-girlfriend, current girlfriend, horribly with a shotgun, and from behind and more than once reloaded the gun. Like, it was a really, really horrific case. It should have been a plea bargain case, right? Because those are the hard cases are the ones you usually go to trial on. But yeah, they said it took them longer to find the button than to come up with a verdict. They had already written it down, voted when they walked in. It was not guilty. Like, they literally walked out and came back in.
Yeah, it was like a 15-minute verdict or something.
Oh, yeah. We hadn't even got up to go to the restroom, I think. We were like clearing up our things off the table to maybe go upstairs and get something to eat or something before. And they came back before we left the courtroom.
Yeah, well, awesome. It's always good to talk about some of the cases that we've worked on. Speaking of that, we're here to talk about one case that you dealt with. You have dealt in your career with a lot of high-profile cases. One of them is a case involving Mark Benavides, an attorney. You want to tell us a little bit about how it was that you got involved in that case?
Well, so that case was like the case, right, for me in my career, because really my boss at the time was Jim Wheat. He was my chief, and he brought me a police report. Someone had made a complaint that Mark had done something inappropriate, and kind of the background of it was there was the Conviction Integrity Unit, which was developed under LaHood's administration, was handling a case because a woman had filed a motion for new trial, and she had been a client of Mr. Benavides, and she was claiming that she didn't understand her plea bargain. I believe her underlying case was intoxication assault, some sort of intoxication felony, and it was pending in the 399th. And so there was this hearing. She testified that before her plea, Benavides had forced her to have sex with him in the jury room of the 399, and so there was all this press because, of course, that's a juicy story. And so in looking into that, the Conviction Integrity folks were concerned because there had been this previous police report that had not really gone anywhere from another woman. So they gave me that, and I knew that this woman that was incarcerated was making a claim. So I said, well, give me an investigator and I'll see what I can do. And I just took it, and my investigator and I started bringing in people, and the more people we talked to, the more evidence we got. And I mean, 3 months into it, we were like in a full-blown investigation, working with SAPD, developing warrants. Like it was unlike anything I'd ever done before, but so kind of fun to do the investigative side, really.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying it was like your career case in a way, very high profile, very prolific. So the idea here was Mark Benavides was a criminal defense attorney, and he had been either appointed or hired to represent a lot of individual ladies. And the allegation is that he was having sex with them as his clients. And as a result of that, there was a coercion that had been taking place. In other words, forcing them to have sex for the benefit of their representation, of his representation. Is that how that worked?
Yeah, it was so twisted. Like, I know there's a lot, and a lot of attorneys, or maybe there are attorneys out there who will sleep with their clients. I'm not advocating for that. I think that's absolutely wrong. But, the bar doesn't necessarily get involved. But this was different because he would act as a bondsman sometimes.
Which means he would secure their bail, make some sort of deposit with the county, and allow them to come out of jail while their case is pending under his supervision in a way.
Well, so there are, as you know, there's attorneys that are able to do that. They've gone through whatever the requirements are to become bondsmen as well. Mm-hmm. He had a attorney friend that would hold the bonds for him. And a lot of us do that. Like, if I have a hired client come in and we want to walk them through so they don't, they can just make their bond and not necessarily spend the night in jail, we might call an attorney that we know that handles bonds and work something out where we both have to then be listed as attorneys of record on a case, right? Mm-hmm. And so we had an attorney that I don't think knew anything about what he was doing, who he would use. Or there may have been more than one, but there was one in particular. And so what Benavides would do is, if he was on someone's bond, then it was their responsibility to check in with him, and he would let that attorney holding the bond know if they didn't check in. So he could say to the woman, if you don't do what I'm telling you to, I'm going to tell your bond attorney that you're not checking in, and he's going to get off your bond. And what we found was he, in fact, did that on some cases. And then he had different ways of procuring women. I mean, it was just very He was having that affair with the person at the jail court, and he was getting appointments on prostitution cases there. He had a type, and he also, we found, would drive around certain areas of town near the jail where there were known prostitution areas and pick up women and then talk to them about their legal cases and get on. And so he was always in a position of power where he was able to control their criminal case. One of the more powerful videos that we had was a woman who actually had the leg monitor on, so she wasn't even able to leave her own home, but he was coming to her to exact, his payment, if you will.
So basically, he would secure a bond, get people released from jail, and essentially tell them, if you don't have some sort of physical contact with me, if you don't have sexual relations with me, then I'm going to have you sent back to jail.
Yeah. It's interesting. I know he ran for judge and he thought himself to be somewhat of a powerful guy. He would imply to these women who didn't know any better that he was this very powerful political figure, that he would exercise his friendships with judges to in fact then also be able to sway what way their case went if they didn't do what he wanted. And so let's say you and I are at a fiesta event and we take a selfie, right? He might take a picture like that, and unbeknownst to the judge or the person, he would show it to these women and say, see, here I am with Judge so-and-so, we're really good friends. So if you don't play, I'm going to tell that person. And we heard this story over and over and over again from many women as the investigation went on. But then what was interesting was we obtained a video that corroborated it all, where he's telling someone these things.
So because he's running for judge, and there are these billboards, there's these placards out there, there's all sorts of information that has his name. And I don't know what was his picture on these particular billboards. Mm-hmm. So he would point to them and say, look, that's me. I'm a powerful political figure. I know all these great people.
Yep.
I got you.
And that's how he was able to convince many of them that they had no choice in the matter.
Right. You mentioned that the case was originally flagged. It kind of came to y'all's attention through the Conviction Integrity Unit. Can you tell our listeners exactly what that is?
So I don't know what they do now. I'm assuming it's around the same thing, but that's a unit that was brought on because everybody's heard about the Innocence Project. There have been wrongful convictions in the past everywhere, I think. Our justice system's blind. It's not perfect. And with the advent of new DNA evidence, there are cases that need to be reviewed, I'm sure. So if someone had issue with a case, they could, my understanding is they could raise it with the Conviction Integrity Unit, who would then look at it and determine whether or not further inquiry needed to happen.
Right.
It's kind of a checks and balance, And so what happened was, when this particular defendant filed her writ and made these accusations, Conviction Integrity got involved because they wanted to make sure that, even though it was a plea bargain case, if something had happened and she should not have been convicted, she ultimately was convicted again later after that kind of whistleblower event. But
so the writ was granted at that point?
I believe, yes, because and see, I didn't handle that part of it, but my understanding was it went all the way to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, part of her issue, and they found her to be credible as far as what she was saying about what happened in that jury room.
And so folks know, we had a podcast episode with an attorney named Dana Jones, who's a writ attorney. We dropped that maybe a month or so ago, maybe a little longer than that. But basically the idea is, once a case has gone through the direct appeal process, the appeals are done, it's over. The only way somebody could then come forward in the future is if a writ is filed. You gave an example of a situation where maybe there's some DNA material on a document, or some let's say clothing or something. And over time, science has developed so much that now we could go back and do additional tests, or maybe there's more information, something new has come out. An individual then could file something called a writ, which would obtain new evidence in the trial court, like the kind of court that I oversee, and then that particular decision-making would go up to the Court of Criminal Appeals with the recommendation from the court. So this went through that process.
Yes.
And then so this raised some sort of flag in your mind. You're working at the time, I guess, with Nico LaHood's administration.
Yes.
And his administration is the one who started this Conviction Integrity Unit, right?
Right.
And so you got your investigators, you started developing some sort of understanding as to what was going on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how the law works as it relates to that type of a charge?
Well, so with the Conviction Integrity Unit, I was separate from what they were doing because they were just, following through with that particular claim. I believe now, under the current one, I believe they're reviewing many of the Mark Benavides cases to see if those need to be reversed. But anyway, but for me, when I started looking at it, we were trying to determine what, if anything, Mark had done that was criminal with regard to his relationships with these people. And based on my experience prosecuting human trafficking and prosecuting sexual abuse, I felt very strongly that he had committed the offense of continuous trafficking. Mm-hmm. And so then, but it was kind of a case of first impression because the law, we weren't sure whether the law would allow for you to be your own pimp, for lack of a better.
Right. So human trafficking case is almost a new charge. When I say new, I mean within the last 15
decade,
years. Yeah. And so you want to tell us what the elements are for a human. A lot of people think human trafficking is being crossing folks from the other side of the border and then allowing them to go free, right? But that's not really, human trafficking is more than that. You want to tell us what the elements of that kind of a charge are?
Right. I think a lot of people think about people being held in chains or people being brought over, like you said, across the border, which is more about a smuggling than trafficking.
Right.
Trafficking in Texas, is by force, fraud, or coercion. There has to be an element of some sort of transporting the person. Mm-hmm. And then there has to, the force, fraud, or coercion was what was really strong to me. And then the fact that he would meet them here and then drive them to the motel. Those were big things.
So that's the transportation part of it.
Right. So, yes, there are pimps who are prosecuted under the trafficking statute more often than not, who are forcing, most often women, but also men are victims of sex trafficking, forcing them to engage in compelling prostitution. There's several offenses listed that if you force them to engage in that falls under that human trafficking statute. And kind of what we were looking at was basically these girls were being prostituted because they were being forced to have sex in exchange for legal services, which was like a pay to play, right? And then that was something that he was transporting them to do at this motel because he almost exclusively went to the same place. And it was by force, fraud, or coercion. What we found is he would coerce them by saying that he would make sure they went to jail. He would commit fraud by pretending to be this big politico and that he had all this power. But then as things moved on, he became more and more violent. So there was also an element of force with some of the attacks or the sexual assaults. That's how we were able to build this case. And so we worked closely with our appeals division, which has always been a unit at the DA's office. It wasn't invented by Nico. I was with Judge Reed for 16 years. It was there with her and before her. So the appellate section helped us write our indictment, do the legal research, because originally he was not indicted for the human trafficking. It was after we did more research and we had been waiting on a case to be decided that would kind of guide us, and that happened. So you can deliver someone to yourself. It doesn't require a third party for it to be trafficking.
So when you say it's a case of first impression, that means that there hasn't, in Bexar County,
right?
That means there hasn't been a case in Bexar County where you've taken this kind of a situation and then tried that. Right.
So, and there were a lot of people, even lawyers in Bexar County, who couldn't understand why we were proceeding that way. It was like, what? This is going to sound really awful, but this is what I was faced with every day. It was like, what's the big deal? So prostitutes slept with them.
It's not a crime in Texas for an attorney to have sex with an ongoing client.
Right.
Ethically, is it? Did y'all look into the ethics of that?
So what was interesting as a member of the bar is many of these women would tell me when I interviewed them that they had complained to the bar. And when I spoke with an investigator at the bar, I was told that yes, there had been complaints, but because they had not gone anywhere, they had been destroyed. So they don't keep the records when they're found to be unfounded or, so I think it's common when you have a criminal defendant filing a complaint and it sounds outlandish, it might just get shut down. But we'll never know because we couldn't get those records. The way we found the women was because of the videos that we obtained.
Okay. So human trafficking then has a range of punishment. First degree felony?
Yes.
Range of punishment from 5 to 99 or life?
Yes, but when it's continuous trafficking of persons, then that bumps up the minimum to 25 years.
So you charge them with continuous, which was 25 to 99, and there's no parole available for that kind of a case.
Exactly.
So if he were to get, let's say, a 50-year sentence, this is one where he would do it day for day, 50 years.
I think, and I don't want to misspeak, Judge, because I've looked at his parole eligibility lately. I think he has to do 40 he received an 80-year sentence. And I believe he has to do 40 calendar years before he's eligible. I know it's under that no parole, but it's not the same as when it's a child. So I think he has to do 40 and then he may be eligible.
Which is a little different than a standard parole eligibility. Let's say somebody were to get life. In a typical, what we think of as a parole eligible, you think of 30 years or half time served or whichever is less. So if somebody were to get a 99-year sentence, well, 30 years is less than 48 years. And so as a result of that, they would be eligible at 30. So here, this is almost like a different type of provision.
So the legislature passed several of these no parole or different parole things when they created trafficking, when they created continuous sexual assault of a young child. That's the one that's 25 to life, no parole, and continuous trafficking of persons. So that's why I say I'm 90% sure he's eligible in 40 years. There's some things about that case I kind of just, have forgotten over the time, but I believe it's 40.
It's been a while. When did this case take place?
April of 2018.
Okay. Well, Meredith, I'm enjoying our conversation. Let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome to the Q&A break. We have a question. Do lawyers have ethical guidelines that they must adhere to or they'll get into trouble? What do you think?
Oh, yes. Well, so we even have a test we have to take in order to be licensed.
That's true. And a class we have to take in law school.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important. And lawyers are the only profession that I know of that have to put it in their contract to their clients. Here's how you report me if you think I did something unethical.
These are my ethical obligations.
That's right.
Absolutely. So what are the guidelines that lawyers have to adhere to?
Oh, Lord, Judge, there's so many.
Let's talk about being a prosecutor.
Well, being a prosecutor has a special duty, and in Texas, it's even more special because in Texas, we don't seek justice. You see that justice is done, and that's a big, to me, that is like something that should weigh on you. I held that very, very close when I did that job.
So what's the difference between seeking justice and seeing that justice is done?
Well, I think when you're seeking it, you can make the excuse, we did our best. We looked for it over here, but when you're seeing that it is done, when something comes to your attention in your case that could be Brady or exculpatory,
something that's a benefit to the defense,
sure, then you have to chase it down like a dog and make sure that you've looked in every corner.
So you got to disclose that type of evidence?
Absolutely.
You got to be honest to the other side, to the court. You can't use the media in a way which will improperly influence potentially the outcome of a jury pool. You can't prejudice the case in that way. You can't make commentary related to a defendant invoking their Fifth or Sixth Amendment right to have an attorney, to remain silent, those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of duties that prosecutors have. By the same token, there's a lot of duties that defense attorneys have.
That's right.
Excellent. Keep those questions coming. Head over to beyondthegavelpodcast.com and send in any questions that you might have. We love answering them on the air for you. Let's head back into the show.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here talking to Meredith Chacon. So you mentioned that he took this initial lady that you figured out there was a potential crime that had been committed with, and he took her into a jury room here at the courthouse. Folks will ask, how is that possible? How can a defendant, I assume she was in custody?
I don't know if she was or not, because we've had allegations of other women that he did that with that weren't in custody. So I don't, she was in custody at the time of all these hearings. I'm not sure. She may have been. Either way, it could have happened. That's what the public needs to know. Either way.
So then the question would be, how is that possible that somebody could go into a jury room of the courthouse like that and engage in that type of relationship?
Well, so there are lots of rooms here at the Justice Center that are used for conferring with witnesses, conferring with our clients, and that we reasonably believe we have a little bit of privacy. For example, the code requires that every court have a witness waiting room where our victims can be. DA's office really has first pick of those witness rooms that are in that as you walk in the courtroom to the side for their witnesses to have a safe place to wait. When those are unoccupied, and the dockets are very big in the morning, we might take a client in and shut the door and confer with the client there. Just this week, I conferred with a client in a jury room. All I had to do was go request from the the deputy, that he opened the jury room for me so that I could sit down with my laptop at the table and really go over some things with this man. And he left us in there alone with the door shut, and the door couldn't be opened from the outside because when it was closed, it was locked. So.
All right. So the attorney-client relationship is one where sometimes you need that privacy.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that you can confer in confidence with your client. And as an officer of the court, an attorney then generally, especially one who is known around the courthouse, would be one that would have the ability to say, hey, let me confer with my client. We need some privacy. And there's nothing that would stand out about that.
Oh, sure. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. So then what happened after you started looking into this situation?
Well, it was really interesting. So we talked to the first lady that had made the first report, and she ultimately did not end up in our indictment. But her case had started way back in 2001, which gives you an idea of how long this had been going on. If he got arrested, I think in 15 or 16.
So she made the allegation that Mark Benavides was doing this in 2001?
There was initially, she made a report to someone in the court that something had happened. And so he represented her in 01. It was a subsequent case she picked up that the court clerk said, oh, I'll appoint your old attorney, and she flipped out, and that's when she made an outcry that something had happened in 01. I want to say that was a few years later. But when we met with her, she told us what had happened, and then we found there was another report that had been made to someone else in the court. So we pulled that record, met with that woman, and she's the one that pointed us in the direction of the hotel. And that's when everything kind of blew up, because we were able to corroborate this specific motel where he was taking women. That's very close to the jail. And so we sent our investigators to that motel to obtain records to find out, was he really going to the hotel? And come to find out, he was going anywhere from 2 to sometimes 5 times a week to that hotel for several years, many years. And so then we obtained surveillance video of him going in and out of the hotel with people that week, and we were able to identify the court coordinator from the jail court as one of the people going in and out of the motel with him. And we also were able to identify a particular female defendant who was pending out of a drug court case, and so we brought her in, right? And so the stories were all the same. He videotaped it. He'd ask them, how old are you? How tall are you? How much do you weigh? All while they're standing naked in front of the camera. And then after he had that discussion, then there would be all sorts of, sex. And the video would then end. And so what the women were telling us is that there was discussion before the camera was turned on about how they would behave. There would be no fighting back. There would be no. And so it was all very, very consistent, and none of these people know each other. So that's a clue as a prosecutor, like, am I having consistent statements without any kind of collusion, right?
As a prosecutor, you were involved in this investigation. In other words, the DA's office was the investigative unit.
It was very unique. And so what we ended up doing when we realized that we were going to need to execute a search warrant, because so many people had given us the same description of the camera, the setup, all the things, we went to SAPD and had a meeting. And so it became a joint investigation at that point, and they assisted with the execution simultaneously of a search warrant and an arrest warrant for Mr. Benavides.
How common is it that the DA's office coordinates with another agency like SAPD to do these investigations?
I can't speak to what they do now. In my experience, during my career, it was rare in what I did. Okay, so in like we're always involved as far as being a part of the multidisciplinary team where child abuse or even sex trafficking is concerned. And the DAs are always there to spitball with detectives and advise them and everything. But by and large, it's not like Law and Order. We're not responding to the scene and out there while they're getting the statement from the defendant, watching it from behind the glass. And that was what was just so absolutely cool about this case, is I was I was there. I wasn't there when they interviewed him, but there were other witnesses. I was down at PD on the other side of the glass, messaging the detective about, well, ask this, It was very neat.
You got to wear the other hat.
Yeah, I got to wear that hat, and it was really fun. I mean, I've got to say that was fun.
And at that time, you were handling human trafficking cases at the DA's office.
So I wasn't ever assigned to the trafficking unit. I just had the opportunity to try several of them. And I was doing primarily child abuse and domestic violence still at that time. But I just I guess I had been there long enough that I started getting assigned special cases. And so this was just one of those opportunities that fell in my lap. And I honestly don't know if they even knew it was going to become what it did. I didn't, because when we executed that search warrant and found 276 videos, that was game over. That was crazy.
How was it exactly that you ended up with this case? You mentioned it fell into your lap. How'd that happen?
I don't know. I think that I'd been there a long time, and Jim Wheat was a good friend and a great boss, and I had been an advocate when he was in the 290th many, many years ago, and he knew that back then even I was like a dog with a bone. If you gave me a witness to find, if you gave me something to do, I was gonna work on that. And so I think that's why he gave it to me.
So you mentioned y'all found 276 videos.
Yeah.
How many women were involved?
Well, we located and identified 35, I believe. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many I listed in the indictment, but I want to say there were 6 or 8 that we listed in the indictment. There were many women we were unable to identify. So what was hard, and this is why this case took a toll, right, is my investigator and I spent about 2 months in a room in the DA's office watching these videos, which were not easy to watch or pleasant to watch. And we would, and the detective had to do this too. Like, he identified many of them, but by the time we got them, there were still unidentified women. So I would watch a video, I would screenshot someone's face, and then we would go into the system and we would look at what cases during that date range Mr. Benavides had cases and what women he was representing at the time, and we would start comparing mugshots. And so we were able to match up people. And so then the task became, we would have our investigator go find these women and bring them in. And imagine, I'm sitting across the table from a woman, and I have to say to her, I obtained some videos through a search warrant of Mark Benavides, and at that point they would just start crying. I mean, they knew that what I had seen, and I'd have to assure them, we're trying to prosecute him, just tell me about what happened, and then we would decide who we could use and not. There were women who thought they were in a relationship with him, that loved him, and he was married. It's just insane. So, yeah. You
mentioned some of the ways that he would meet these individuals. Were most of them his clients?
By and large, most of them either were his clients before he started sleeping with them, or they became his clients. So he at one point had a pimp that he had obtained women through. We spoke to that person. That person had his own legal issues. We offered no deals, okay? But we did speak to him and confirm that he did know and had dealt with Mr. Benavides. I think what happened was he found a way to cut out the middleman. And so, and then by having his connection in jail court, as sick as it sounds, that's what he did. He would go in there and he would get appointed on cases when other attorneys didn't show up, where particularly women were there on prostitution cases, or they fit a certain physical profile for him. Because he would walk in and, we even found through court records there had been complaints made by defense attorneys that Mark was getting appointed on the cases they were already on. And, that's why that person lost their job, is they were giving him cases. We were unable to determine if she knew what he was doing. And I find it hard to believe as a woman that she knew what he was doing with these women, because she was also in a relationship with them. But we never knew for sure.
So you're going on through your investigation, you're figuring out some of the things that he was involved in. What happened then? So
that's when we had the day he was arrested, it was the same day they served the search warrant. So he got arrested, and that's when we started reviewing the evidence for his indictment.
How long did it take from the time that you started investigating until the time you actually effectuated that search warrant and then arrested him?
I want to say it was like 9 months.
Mm-hmm. Now, at this time, you mentioned earlier that he was on the ballot. He was running for office.
I think he had already lost, because he lost his bid prior to us filing the case. But he had, he had run for the court that he thought he would be in charge of, the Esperanza Court, which is the court for to help people who have a history of being victimized in that way.
It's a specialty court.
Yes. But he had already lost that by the time he was picked up.
9 months go by. What happens then? You guys picked him up on some sort of warrant?
So we knew that he would visit the hotel typically on certain days. So the way we decided to do it, we were concerned that because of his knowledge of the system and the people that he knew, that if a warrant crossed somebody's desk, he might know ahead of time. So we made a very strategic decision that we were going to serve both at the same time, and we were going to catch him leaving the hotel. We weren't going to let him get home. We weren't going to. So I left work and knew they were working on it. they called me, I don't know, 5:30 or 6 that evening and said, we got him. And so he had been to the hotel. As he left the hotel, they followed him. They pulled him over. At the same time, officers were at his home serving the search warrant. And then he went downtown and talked to the detective. And that's when the detective left the room and he called his brother and asked his brother to destroy the videos. And that's how we knew we really had something. We hadn't even looked at the DVDs yet, but based on the fact that he didn't want us to see them, we knew that was good for us.
He was taking an SAPD to do an interview.
Yes.
And he had agreed to do that.
He went in the room, and I don't know what other defense attorney would, but he went in the room and then he talked to the detective for a bit and then sort of invoked his rights. I think it was arguable whether he did or not, but I think our detective was a little nervous about interviewing a defense attorney too, right? So he just said, okay, I'm gonna leave the room. And so then, there's always a phone there. So Mark picked up the phone and called his brother and asked him to get rid of the evidence.
Sort of described what it was that he wanted him to get rid of.
Yeah, he said, those videos I told you about, you got to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know whether his brother knew exactly what was going on. A lot of people turned a blind eye because they thought he was just unfaithful to his wife, just kind of a hound dog, if you will. But this was way worse than that.
Subsequent to that, then, y'all filed the case, or?
Yeah, so the after the arrest happened, it took a bit to indict him, and then I indicted him initially, I think, for compelling prostitution.
Mm-hmm. What's that charge?
So that charge is it's a lower charge than the continuous trafficking, and that's where you kind of force someone. It's similar. There's a force or a fraud or a element to it to commit the offense of prostitution. Mm-hmm. But we were still waiting on could we use trafficking without a third party, and once that case was decided, then I re-indicted for the trafficking. Okay. I always wanted the trafficking. For me, it was no question there, but there was a lot of heated debate about that with me and my friends in appeals.
I can imagine, right? I mean, this is like a novel. It's a novel type of charge, with a different situation, a different scenario, not the kind of case we see every day.
Yeah.
And so you indicted it that way, then it fell into a court, and then?
Well, so we fell into a court. It was like no judge in the courthouse here really wanted to touch it. And part of that was because I think it was too close to home. So the judges, I don't remember what court it was officially assigned to, but it wasn't like we could assign it to any court. So it was the decision was made to have a visiting judge assigned
from out of town.
Yes.
Now, I don't necessarily recall when that happened. I was on the bench at that time, right? All I know is that the charge had come down and a visiting judge was going to be assigned. So did y'all go to the regional administrative judge and ask for a visiting judge? I
don't think we asked for one. I think whatever court it went to may have. I just know that it got assigned to Judge Alcala, and that was fine with everybody. He's great. He's very nice, very pleasant. And really as an advantage to both sides, when you have a visiting judge, you can pick dates. You can, if you've got a lot of witnesses, it makes it easier because you don't have to worry about a court docket. So I was like, that's great.
And it makes sense, right? Because Mark Benavides was practicing law in Bexar County primarily.
Right.
And so any judge in Bexar County would have had the experience of having him in on some of their cases. And so you never want the public to perceive any sort of favoritism, any sort of maybe nefarious action going on. You want to make it as clean as possible, right? Ethically, you want it to come across, and you want it to be ethically the kind of situation where you think of justice. So it makes sense to me that no judge locally would want to be involved.
Oh, sure.
And then so that particular case somehow or another was then transferred venue to another jurisdiction.
Well, that was the crazy thing that happened much later.
Yeah, so what was the situation with that?
Well, and I totally agree with you. I think that especially because part of and the rumors were going around, right, about what he did. Part of what he did was he used his pictures of judges or relationships with judges. So for him to get a fair trial, in all fairness, he needs to know that the judge isn't up there thinking, well, did he use my name? I mean, and so that absolutely, if I was a judge in Bexar County, I would not have wanted to have that case either.
Some sort of retaliation.
Sure.
What the heck you doing using my image in a way to benefit yourself?
And who knew? Which ones he did and didn't do. So there's that. And initially, it's very interesting. When the case first was filed, the defense did file to have a change of venue because they because of the press, which a lot of times defense attorneys will do if there have been any stories. But as you know, that's a very high burden. You've got to prove that you can't get a fair jury. And that wasn't something they were going to win. And they didn't win that argument. So at first, we fought that. We won that. And it was going to stay in Bexar County. What happened was, as we approached our trial date, we were in conference with the judge discussing potential dates to have the trial. I had a surgery and there was a trip one of the defense attorneys had or something like that. So we were trying to figure out, when are we going to try this thing? And I had been going through the evidence and meeting with witnesses, and I had mentioned to the defense counsel, we hadn't even thought about this, but there's more than one jury room that these people have told us about. There's more than one witness waiting room that these people have told us about. He was having sex all over the place, like in this courthouse, in the old courthouse, in Old County Court 6, in those jury rooms. I said, so what do we do about the fact that the jury might be deliberating in a crime scene? That's
an interesting question. Yeah.
I just threw it out there, to the room, and my trial partner, Jay Norton, who's been around forever, he was like, yeah. So we had talked to appeals about it, and we had decided if there was going to be if we could agree to transfer to get away from, we didn't care if it was in another building, just to get out of the crime scene, what could we do? So we just kind of talked to the defense and we put it to Judge Alcala. And he said, well, why don't we try it in Floresville? Because that's where he's from, I guess, or that's where he was living. And they had a courtroom there and we could probably use it.
It's a neighboring county.
And so we did it by agreement.
Interesting. And so the defense team was very well known. Defense team, excellent lawyers. I guess you had to prepare to know that these are former prosecutors. These are lawyers that had a great experience in terms of handling these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
So they were appointed or hired to represent?
They were hired. They were hired, but I know both of these people, and they'll work hard whether they're hired or they're appointed. They're both very good attorneys.
Excellent attorneys.
And they fought hard for their guy. But, honestly, and you know this because as a judge, you've seen it, I would rather have, as a prosecutor, a really good defense attorney on the other side, because then I know my record's protected.
I agree with that. And I tell people that it's always good to have excellent lawyers on both sides. You want to explain to the listeners why it is important as a prosecutor to want good lawyers on the other side?
So as the prosecutor, I have a duty to not violate the rules. I have a duty to make sure that I'm playing the way you're supposed to, right? But there are things that we're going to try to get into evidence that if a proper objection isn't made or the proper procedures aren't followed or the proper motions aren't filed, the person could get their conviction potentially reversed later, which is a nightmare.
So what was the trial like for you? What was it like to go through this process? I can imagine you're in another county. You had to do a little bit of traveling, not too much, right? But a little bit of traveling every day to and from the courthouse. The media was involved. Very high profile. So during the course of the trial, I can imagine you had a lot of pressure on you as it relates to bringing forth these charges against a criminal defense attorney. What was it like day by day, going through the process, bringing in witnesses, making your arguments? What was that experience like?
The courtroom there is interesting. It's small because that particular court, they had renovated an old elementary school, so the DA's office was kind of joined to and the court offices are down the halls that used to be classrooms, and the courtroom was this very small, compact courtroom. So we were on top of each other. So on this trial, it was just a relentless, thing, because we would go back to the hotel after the day and we'd game plan. And we were also editing and clipping videos, because we did not play, however many hundreds of hours these videos were. We gave everything to defense, but we picked clips. And so we had made compilation clips that we would present with the witnesses. So we had to edit those at night and get everything ready for the next witness. And so it was a constant, 24 hours.
So when the trial started with these videotapes, you played one initially, and there was some sort of adverse reaction from one of the jurors. Yeah. What was the situation with that?
So let me set the stage, because they're listening, not watching. So small courtroom. First witness takes the stand, and she was one who was particularly emotional about her testimony. And I have the TV turned around so the media can't see the video. We're just going to play it for the witnesses and the jury. So the media is looking at the back of the TV because it was very explicit. And this was one of the rougher videos to watch because there was a lot of, very assaultive things happening.
So you didn't want the media or folks in the gallery that are observing the trial to be able to see.
Right.
Trying to maintain
her dignity.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I had put my head down so that I was not like, I'm right on top of her, I'm right on top of them, and the sex is playing behind me. So I kind of had my head down where I couldn't see, and I was just listening, letting the video play. And I hear the judge go, stop it now. So I jumped up and stopped the video, and I saw that the jury was running out of the room, and then a juror passed out. As they were leaving the courtroom. She was just overcome, and she collapsed. And at that point, I turned to my trial partner and I told him, you go tell that person that he can have 25 years today and we can stop all of this, or I'm going to bury him under this courthouse. And I would have pled it out when that person fainted because I felt like, she was, my victim was going through a lot on the stand and it was getting ugly. He was really like trying to give her the stink eye and stuff. And the jury saw that. They told us that later. But, part of what you think about when you're plea bargaining as a prosecutor is what's best, what's justice, and is protecting these people from having to come and tell about these very intimate things and playing these videos and being the people on TV. Is that part of what you think about? Yes, I was willing to do that at that point. After that, no.
So you went through the guilt innocence portion. How long did that last?
It was right around Easter when we tried it. So I can't remember if it lasted the full 4 days or if Easter was the next week. But it was like a week, and then we did punishment.
That sounds like a pretty fast trial. How many witnesses did y'all put up in 4 days?
Oh, it was 4 or 5. Let's see. Well, there were the 6 or 8 girls, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact number. I remember lots of their names, but I won't say their names.
It was a multi-count indictment.
Multi-count indictment. I think it was mostly lay witness testimony, so non-experts. So that's why it went a little quicker than maybe a trial where there would have been a lot of DNA or a lot of expert testimony.
All right. So then you basically, guilt innocence is done, jury's deliberating. How long did they deliberate?
On guilt innocence, it was a few hours. It wasn't overnight.
With a lot of counts?
8, because it's maybe 8, I think.
8 counts. So that's a separate case, right? The way the law works, each count could be indicted individually. It could be 8 separate cases. Theoretically, they could get stacked, especially since we're dealing with a crime that is sexual in nature. So jury comes back with a verdict of guilty on 8 counts. Y'all just picked up the next day and went right into punishment.
Right into punishment. And he was taken into custody.
How long was the punishment case?
Punishment case was not as long.
They generally are not.
I just remember him testifying in punishment, and I got to cross-examine him for a while. That was fun.
Is this an attorney that you actually had cases against?
No, because this is going to sound catty, but it's true. Mark didn't really take big cases. He was mostly a misdemeanor lawyer, and then the felonies that he did have, they weren't the kind of cases that I dealt with.
Looking back, I assume he had cases in the court that I worked in, the 379th. I recall maybe 1 or 2 instances of him having cases with me. But there were generally, when you do pleas are so fast, you're dealing with so many people, things don't really stand out, which means we didn't really have a trial. We didn't really have, there was one matter, I remember it was contested. I don't remember what the facts were. I don't remember what the allegations were. I just remember seeing him in there. But generally speaking, he wasn't somebody that I saw much of in the courthouse.
He was a plea bargain lawyer, was kind of his reputation. And the other thing, I'm not, especially doing what I did, being a child abuse prosecutor, being a domestic violence prosecutor, someone like Benavides, who really only related to women as women he could control, he wasn't going to interact with me. I'm not his girl. You know what I mean? Like, that was never going to be. I think one time we conferred about a case and he took my first offer. Like, it was just, and that was it. But he really was not in that orbit. And I think it's because he knew I could see through him. You can just tell.
Yeah. I got a lot of satisfaction. I gained a lot personally out of being a prosecutor. Loved my job. I loved being a defense attorney. I loved being a judge. Basically, I love the practice of law, and we should always challenge ourselves to do better and learn more and everything that goes along with being the best that we could be, right? It's very gratifying.
Oh, yeah. And you get to care about the people that you're dealing with on your case if you're real involved in it. And this one was one I was just unusually involved in, so.
Excellent. All right. So Meredith, I've enjoyed this conversation.
Oh yeah, I know. I've enjoyed talking to you, Judge. You've been here a long time.
Any last words that you would have for our listeners?
Well, what I said earlier, I think that, the people need to come down to the courthouse, see what's going on, get to know their judges, get to know their candidates, really invest in these local elections so that we have fair and experienced judges and DAs doing the job down here, and things will go a lot better.
Very well said. We've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and keep sending in those questions. Remember, you can now text the show by clicking Text the Judge to send in your insights, your reviews, and your questions. Thanks for all of you dedicated listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks where we are educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.